are very welcome to this morning's CBI webinar. My name is Kerry Thomas. I'm one of the editors at a new startup called Tortoise, and a great pleasure as ever to be doing these events with the CBI. Actually, particularly this morning, I think, is one of the great things I think about these webinars is that they give us the chance to talk about subjects which in the middle of a pandemic can feel slightly neglected. And actually, I can't think of a better example of that than immigration, which we're here to talk about this morning. We are weeks away from a change which will have huge implications for any employer who wants to recruit outside the UK. So as you know, from January, the UK is moving to a points-based system for immigration. And ordinarily, I think, that would have been still front page news everywhere. We'd still be arguing over the rights and wrongs of the change in principle. And we'd be looking at how it might affect different sectors in practice. But the fact is, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of lockdown, in the middle of an economic crisis, we haven't talked about this very much at all. So it's a great pleasure to have the Minister responsible with us today. That's Kevin Foster, who's the Immigration Minister. And we also have a real expert in immigration and employment in the shape of Jürgen McCluskey, who's a partner at Deloitte. And you should know that Deloitte have put together with the CBI a guide for employers, which I'm told you'll be able to download through this webinar platform this morning. I'm expecting a lot of questions, so please do fire those in. There'll be a questions button somewhere on your screen. If you want to put in a question anonymously, then just write anon at the top of it and we will deal with that in confidence. And I do know that the CBI will monitor the questions that come in and try to respond to any later in the day that we don't get to in the course of this call. As ever, we have one of the CBI senior team with us this morning, Chief UK Policy Director Matthew Fell. Matthew, very good morning to you. Let's kick off with you. Before we get right into immigration, which I think we should do as soon as we can, it's always worth just putting our heads up and looking around at other big developments. What else has caught your eye in the last few days?
Yeah, well, thanks, Kerry, and good morning, everyone. A few things that we've got top of the priority list for this week. First, no surprise on COVID and a couple of things there. I think one, just increasing calls for clarity from business about what happens after the 2nd of December and this national lockdown in England, knowing what are the approach and the basis that we're going to be moving to after that, what support will be available to me, a call for transparency around the criteria that will be used to judge that. So essentially a message, can we have some forward guidance as to what the situation is going to be? It proved very effective in Wales, where businesses had at least 5 days notice about what the situation was going to be, so they could let their employees, their suppliers get ready for reopening and so on, where they were able to do so. So that forward guidance is really important, and we're working hard on getting that. The other piece on COVID that we're working hard on this week is around testing, and in particular workplace testing. So being able to understand what companies can do if they implement that, particularly about the sort of test and release approach to get people back into work where they're healthy and it's safe to do so. The prioritization, those key enabling industries right across the country. And again, guidance for business with many different sort of forms of testing out there, helping them to understand what's okay to use and what's appropriate for different workplace settings. So plenty going on the COVID front. In addition to that, Brexit, again, a really clear message from us. We were active in the press and in public forums yesterday. Message, just get it done. We've now got so many examples of companies doing their absolute best in terms of preparation and so on, but whether it be supermarkets and food produce in Northern Ireland, manufacturing components and rules of origin, services firms needing to get a data adequacy agreement over the line on the back of a deal. Essentially, companies flying blind now on their preparations and needing to get that deal done and agreed. And then finally, Kerry, in terms of a roundup, I would say from me, an eye to the recovery. Really good news this morning with the government's 10-point plan on the green industrial revolution. A very clear statement of intent, and one we think that can be a real springboard for jobs and investment as we head into 2021.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Let's now turn to immigration. You've obviously been working on this, putting together this guide with Deloitte, so we'll talk to Jürgen about that shortly. Where do you think we're at on this, Matthew? What's the CBI's view of the current situation?
Well, I think my first observation, Kerry, is that this is just a very significant change for business. If I think about all the ramifications of the UK leaving the European Union, I would say that for most businesses, this is near top or almost the top issue that they're going to have to get their heads around. I also think it's worthwhile recognising that this is going to be launched into quite a different labour market to the one that we envisaged 12 months ago as we deal with the fallout of COVID. I think the new system that we're moving to has some positive changes for business, removal of a cap on visas, lowering of some skills and salary thresholds, post-study work visas for international students. Those are all good things that CBI has been pushing for. But also, I think there are many aspects that a number of firms will find really challenging, and particularly the absence of any route for workers with skill levels below level 3. So impacting particularly, we think, care, hospitality, parts of the logistics sector and so on. That will be a big change and a big impact there. Other thought from me, Kerry, would be that actually what we're launching to is almost sort of version 1 of a new system. There's promise of more on the way, which all sounds good stuff. New routes, simplifying rules, streamlining processes and digitization and so on. That is going to be terrific, but we're going to have to live with a sort of early iteration of the system and then move to those over time. And then that other improvement we really want to see that will be critical for firms. We'll get into this in the detailed conversation, but the so-called shortage occupation list, really important that that tracks and keeps sort of dynamic with changes in the economy so it adapts to the skills that firms need and are struggling to find over time. But overall, for me, a really big change and really important that firms get their head around this, hence why we're so pleased to partner with Deloitte on this guide today to help firms navigate it.
Okay, Matthew, let me just check. The sharp-eyed among you would have noticed that we can't see Kevin Foster on the screen, the Immigration Minister, because the Home Office's firewall, I think, has taken back control of his computer. But we are, Kevin may be there. Kevin, are you there?
Hello there. Hi. Good to speak to you.
Great. Thanks for joining us. Let me just start with asking you just to explain the nuts and bolts of the system. Can you just give us the sort of 2 or 3 minute pitch on how the points-based system is going to work?
Well, thanks for the invitation. I think the core message of the new points-based system is that it is a global system. And if you're recruiting people outside the UK, and I would say Irish citizens, given the historic rights that they enjoy within the United Kingdom, then this system applies to that recruitment. So there's no more a two-tier system of recruitment from the EEA versus recruitment of non-EEA of nationals. And where we're looking to go with it is, one, we're looking at, it's fairer. It judges people by the skills and talents they have, not their passport. The second part of it is we're looking to make it simpler. As touched on, we are reforming some of the wider rules. So even where tax aid policy, for example, having an English language standard may not change, we are looking at how we can make it work in a smoother manner, and some of the maintenance rules as well, and things like removing the maximum time you can be on a skilled worker visa and dropping the settlement amount to make an equivalent skilled worker. So it's easier for people to settle once they've arrived as a skilled worker, which is a benefit to businesses looking to retain more experienced staff. But the core of it is people have to have 70 points to come under the skilled worker route. There's mandatory elements, which is a job offer from a licensed sponsor, speaking English, and having a salary that meets the threshold. And there are some tradable points people can use. So, for example, if you've got a PhD relevant to the role, that can count as 10 points, which allows a slightly lower salary threshold to be met. And the general salary threshold will be 25,600, or the market rate for the job concerned. And we're broadening the skills threshold, because at the moment those who recruit outside the EEA will know our threshold is degree level jobs effectively. We felt that looking to the new system that was very much academic focused and didn't reflect many of the skills that employers do need to try and seek on a wider basis. So therefore it goes to school leaver as the RQF3, as we technically call it. But as has already been touched on, the one thing we won't be including in the route, in the new visa, is a sort of general route for recruiting at or near the minimum wage on a global basis. We're clear that the priority, where people are looking for more general skills, the priority should be looking to recruit from the domestic market first, not least, and has been touched on already, as we face the monumental challenges next year of getting people back into work, but also getting the next generation into their first job, which will be a challenge I think both government and business have to take on together.
Great. Okay. And tell me, does this are the calculations here purely on need for skills and sectors that require that where recruitment from abroad can help fill gaps, or does this sit alongside a target for immigration as well?
Well, generally, we've said we're not going to get into a numbers game around immigration. That's why, for example, as has already been touched on, we've suspended the cap. And the jobs can qualify under the skilled worker route, provided they meet the salary and the workplace training thresholds. But where that means giving employers, we hope, also a chance in a range of roles to look globally for talent and to have teams that then can really help drive the business forward from a global perspective. But where the shortage occupation list comes in is where we recognise there's a specific shortage in an area, and therefore allow jobs that would qualify under the skilled worker visa more widely to be recruited at a discount rate compared to the market rate or the salary threshold, subject to a minimum of 20,480. And there are some public sector, mostly jobs like nursing and teaching, that are better salary thresholds based on the national pay scale.
Okay, and has there been a moment with everything else going on, midst of a pandemic, lockdowns and economic crisis, has there been a moment when you've looked at the possibility of delaying this because employers have got so much else to deal with?
No. I think whenever we introduced this type of system, if it was a period of low unemployment and high growth, people would be claiming that it's a difficult time when they're struggling to recruit. If we do it at another time, people might argue that there's particular needs. I think whenever we made this change, there was going to be people who'd rather stick with the current system, particularly sectors that I would generally say have over-relied on the ability to recruit from abroad rather than looking to develop and offer more attractive packages within the domestic market. So we haven't considered that. We looked at actually, whilst I think it's probably safe to say hospitality was touched on, I represent an area that has a lot of hospitality businesses. There's not many recruiting at the moment, I think it has to be said. In fact, sadly, quite the opposite. Actually bringing this in, giving a sense of certainty, and also we are doing things that make it easier business. So, for example, if you are one of our over 34,000 Tier 2 licensed sponsors, we are going to roll your sponsorship license over into the new system. So those already recruiting outside the EEA aren't going to have to then apply for a new license, those sorts of things. So, no, we felt it's right to have certainty, to bring in the new system, and then hopefully as we start to recover next year and firms in the economy more generally start to recruit again, this is already something that's in place and they can work with.
Okay, Minister, do stay there because I can see we've got a flood of questions in already. We're going to get loads more, so I'm going to come back to you with some of those. But before I do, let me bring in Jürgen McCluskey, because Jürgen, the Minister there talked a little about the sponsorship license, which is one of the important features of the new system as well. How does an employer know if he or she needs a sponsor license, and what is it?
That's an easy one, Kerry. You're starting me off with a very easy question. If you need to hire foreign nationals to work for you in the UK and you know they need a work permit, they don't qualify any other way, you need a sponsor license. So it's really quite straightforward. And to the remarks made by the Minister just earlier on, that is exactly what this new system is aiming to achieve. It's a one-tier system. So in essence, every single nationality will qualify under the same system. So sponsor license is absolutely essential if you're sponsoring migrants. How you obtain one, that's a bit more complicated question, and I guess this is where our guide will be really helpful and important. I suppose I see this guide as this trusted advisor that you can have nearby at all times, and you refer to it to understand exactly what processes to follow. How do you apply for a sponsor license is one of those questions that we deal with in there, Kerry.
Okay, and as you said, the aim here is to simplify a system, and I think people who had to work with the previous system, the existing system, could easily have pointed to faults within there. So there does seem potential. What, from your perspective, how complicated do the rules and procedures look for the employer, and what are the pitfalls do you think that employers would need to be aware of?
Okay, I think that one thing to say first of all, and I agree with everything that the minister said in terms of aiming to simplify the system. The point of this new points-based system is to make it more straightforward, more simplified, more efficient, right? Frankly, everything is changing. So to your point earlier, Carrie, this is very, very, very significant. I don't think we've ever changed the system quite this significantly before. So it cannot be underestimated the significance of a change. But the simplicity of it is also key, right? So understanding it to the point of every nuance and the detail is very difficult to do if you're not an expert in immigration as a field. What should you be thinking about, and what you should, what is the main thing to address is really just understanding the procedures, and understanding how these foreign nationals can, in essence, how many foreign nationals you hire, do you need to hire them, and then look to see whether your internal policy and process is adapted to that particular thing. Can you sponsor foreign nationals? And if you do, what is the policy and process that you already have in place? Do you need to change that, considering that obviously Europeans are now falling into the fold of sponsoring nationalities? Now, understand your obligations. That is also really, really important. When you're sponsoring someone, you have a number of obligations that you need to comply to in terms of overall compliance as a sponsor, overall reporting obligations. Again, that's key. Really, really try and understand what that means to you as an organization. And also, I would say, and this is really important, understand right to work policies and processes. Get these amended by June 2021, because again, your European population will fall into the fold of some of nationalities that will require right to work beyond just simply demonstrating the passport. So again, a really important point to note.
Great. Thank you, Jürgen. We'll come back to you shortly, I'm sure. Minister, Kevin Foster, if you're still there, I hope. One question we've had in already from Stuart MacArthur, who asks whether, given the increased number of visa applicants who are now going to need to meet an English language proficiency test, whether any thought has been given to how you're going to make sure there are enough test centres globally, because Stuart's point is that that has been a blockage in the system in the past. It's now going to increase radically in scope. Have you thought about that as a potential blocker?
Yeah, we have thought, and certainly we're reviewing a lot of business. We expect demand around EEA nationals will be fairly low in the initial months of the new system, because in essence, someone can arrive under free movement here until the 31st of December, but it's certainly something we've looked at. We've also slightly altered some of the English language rules under the new system to remove, for example, people who'd studied at state schools in the UK who had an A-level in English. It was rather strange that we then required them, in some circumstances, to go off and do a secure English language test. So we are looking at capacity, working with our partners, and of course there's some elements where people will already qualify anyway. So, for example, if they've studied a degree at taught in English, then they already qualify in terms of the English language requirement. But it is something that we're conscious of and will obviously monitor as we go through, just to give a reassurance on that front.
Okay. Further question. When will the guidance for sponsors document be updated to provide companies with more practical advice outlining requirements and how to implement some of those requirements?
As I say, we'll be rolling over sponsor license. If you're an existing sponsor, don't worry about thinking you're going to have to apply for a new license between now and the 1st of January. But what I would say is we're imminent to publish a range of new guidance. We're also looking to have what we call a points calculator online, so that it becomes easier to check whether a particular role qualifies as under the new visa rule. But we're imminent to publish a range of further guidance.
Okay, let me turn to the question of people who are not covered by the points-based system. Let's turn our attention to potentially social care assistance. You've already said that you want and you think there might be demand, given the employment situation, for more people who are currently in the UK to do those kind of jobs. But I think some people look at the position of social care assistants, the number of people who were born abroad who are working as care assistants in social care, and they worry that we're in danger of creating a massive problem for ourselves at a really bad time. Tell us how you expect that social care system to function under this new system, and how quickly you could stand ready to review it if you found that actually there were vacancies that were impossible for employers to fill.
I think first, I think there's two parts to the social care system. Let's start with the fact that not every job in social care is one that doesn't require training and work-based education. So actually the new health and care visa, if you're recruiting nurses, and we will be looking shortly to review in line with the new skill threshold. For example, senior care assistants do qualify as RQF3. So that will actually make it simpler, and you can recruit on a global basis via the health and care visa. But for more general jobs, more general skills in social care, we generally don't believe it's right that the first port of call should be immigration policy. And certainly myself and the employment minister regularly compared notes about sectors that are very keen to talk to me about immigration, but haven't been as keen in the past to talk to her about her schemes to get people into employment, or for that matter, some of the other areas around training or disability confident work. So I think we want, and also particularly if we're going to get people to see, and one of the things that's come out of the last few months is that social care is something we need to value more. And if we constantly talk about social care on the basis of what we really need is an immigration policy so that we can always ensure social care assistants are paid the minimum wage, that's not going to inspire anyone to go into this sector. And yes, there's obviously going to have to be debates about long-term funding as well. But I don't think, if the lesson people have taken out of the last few months is that what we need is an immigration system that guarantees we can always recruit into that sector at the minimum wage. That's the wrong message to have taken.
What do you do? I hear the message, and I think we'd all agree that there's been this sort of re-evaluation of the importance of jobs in sectors like social care over the last several months. No question about that. But what are you going to do if your hope is unfulfilled, if those vacancies aren't capable of being filled by people in the UK at the moment?
Well, I think the reality is these are roles we're talking about are roles that actually the vast majority of people could fill. So we're not talking about nurses or those with specific qualifications that are needed in terms of experience. So I think we'd also then need to actually have more of a conversation rather than coming straight to the immigration minister. What we'd need to do is start actually look at, what is it about not being able to recruit? With, very sadly seeing a lot of people at the moment in our country who are losing their jobs and are facing an uncertain future. And that means we do need to just dig that little bit more deeply than just reach for the immigration button as to what may be the reason why we're not recruiting in those types of sectors. And to add on, there's still the flow of people coming under our more general migration routes, such as the family routes, such as dependents of skilled workers. So those who come in on the skilled worker visa can bring their dependents who will have a general, if they're over 18, a general right to work in the United Kingdom. So again, that is a flow of labour, plus the British nationals overseas route, which covers up to potentially 5.4 million people resident in Hong Kong. So I think the problem is with this sector, and like with any other sector, and I do particularly looking at this one, if every time we say there's a shortage, our first hit button is to go for immigration, it doesn't tackle the long-term issues there. And the Migration Advisory Committee has been very clear that actually the people who really lose out of creating these type of sector schemes are the workers in the sector themselves.
Matthew, let me bring you in, because I'd love to know what employers are saying to you about their concerns if they do recruit people without high qualifications from overseas, and that has been a large chunk of their workforce. How worried are people about their ability to recruit those kind of jobs?
Yeah, well, thanks, Gary. I think, as Kevin has just described, in a sense, the level of concern will depend on where you've been historically and how you make the transition from one setup to another, and that will vary sector by sector. What I was actually going to say is, morning, Minister. Brilliant to have you on the call, and thanks for all the collaboration that we've had with you and your team in shaping this new system. I got a couple of thoughts, if that's okay, to sort of maybe be great if people on the call would be able to hear your thoughts on these. One would be, in a sense, as we adapt to this new system, and it's deliberately designed to evolve and improve, building improvements over time, if companies have got thoughts on once it goes live and once they experience it, how that can be improved and built on over time. Question one, would you just maybe say a little bit about how they can best sort of feed those thoughts and experiences in and so on? And then my second thought is that throughout this pandemic, we've been trying to find sort of things that have been positive and have worked well, and how we embed those in the future. And I think one of those examples here would be around the digitization of some of the sort of right to work checks, the DBS checks and so on. And again, a thought from me would be, do you think there's scope of sort of making that in permanently so that we seize some of the benefits and effective ways of working through that?
Minister, are you still there?
Oh, yes, hello. Right, okay, so I'll explain. First, in terms of digitisation, absolutely. In fact, our goal is to move towards having a system that's fully digitised, and actually into the ranges of public services, looking at how people no longer have to present a BRP, but where actually the biometric residence permit showing their migration status, but where it could be automatically checked, particularly in a healthcare scenario where if someone's been admitted to hospital, the first thing on their mind might not have been to take their immigration documents with them. So we're certainly looking at digital. As we know, the EU settlement scheme, that is our way of granting status to those who came here under free movement, is fully digital. And that is certainly something that we'd looked at. And we saw, I think, 400,000 uses of View and Prove between April and June, including those who with BRPs use it. So yes, we're certainly looking at more digital. One of the things that's been less talked about is actually the skilled worker visa for EEA nationals will be something the vast majority of them can apply from home for, because we're adapting some of the technology we've used for the EUSS via smartphones to the wider visa system. So it's a goal we have is to go fully digital with our immigration system, with fallback options where there are problems and for the most vulnerable. So it's definitely an ambition. And some of the learning we're taking out, things like biometric reuse, is something that we've tried this year. That's not asking people to resubmit their face and fingerprints each time they apply for further leave, which has been successful with students. We're looking to extend that to slightly more people now. And then finally, in terms of adapting, what I would say to people is keep the feedback coming through represented bodies. We have stakeholder consultative panels. We have a panel on simplifying the immigration rules as well. So do keep the feedback coming in. I think what I'd say is we always appreciate hearing where there might be odd outcomes. I think where we have to say that we are less inclined for feedback is where people say they can't recruit under a migration system but haven't taken part in things like the schemes that our colleagues in DWP are doing. That's where we do take a view that if you're looking to recruit, it should be domestic first and then international second for the skills you genuinely can't access in the UK labour market.
Okay. Minister, let's keep going with this idea of how flexible and responsive the system will be, because I think it's quite interesting. How, for example, around the list of shortage occupations, how often, how quickly can that be reviewed if it doesn't seem as if it's doing the job?
Well, normally we can commission. We used to in the past commission the MAC on more of an ad hoc basis. The Migration Advisory Committee will in future be producing annual reports and annual commentary on the Migration Advisory Committee, and of course it would be at liberty in that to give commentary around the shortage occupation list. We're keen that actually becomes something we work with across government. So, for example, this shortly be meeting with the Skills Minister and the Employment Minister, because actually if we're identifying shortages from an immigration point of view, that tells us what we should be looking to do from a skills point of view and encouraging people into particular jobs and roles, because many of them are actually quite highly paid. So it's not, we need to break this idea that jobs on the shortage occupation list are those near the lower ends of salary. They can be far from it. And yes, we can alter it. For example, it'll sound a minor example, but a couple of months back we added archaeologists onto the list. We'll going through the review of the MAX report with a view to making changes next year more widely to reflect the new thresholds in the system, but it is something that can adapt and can change over time. And we're clear that the core of this is that it can be flexible. It's why the migration rules are in secondary legislation, not primary legislation.
Is there a danger that it becomes always a rear view mirror on the jobs that this country needs rather than a look forward? If you're reviewing it mostly annually with some flexibility, but is there a risk that it's a look back rather than look ahead?
Again, we look to the Migration Advisory Committee to also look forward as well, and again with engagement with sectors. For example, if we're going to have major infrastructure projects, then it's likely that, for example, demand for engineers may go up. But also, we should be using partly some of the data to look forward as well to see where skills and demands will be needed, because actually that's also needs to link in as part of a UK labour market strategy to where we're encouraging skills and training to happen. What roles are the careers advisors of today suggesting for the job seekers of tomorrow? And we're very keen that immigration policy should dovetail with our strategies for the UK labour market overall, not be something we debate in complete isolation to them.
Okay, thanks for that. Jürgen, let me just come back to you. We've had a question from Victoria Sargent about cost. I don't know if this is possible to answer this question, but Victoria's asking whether you have an idea of the average first year cost of hiring a foreign national, including process change, licenses, etc. Have you tried to calculate what it might cost?
We did, Kerry. I don't have the figures at the top of my head, but they are in the guide, actually, because we spent some time trying to come up with a number. So I encourage Victoria to take a look and understand exactly how it sort of divides between various different payments that would be accounted for anything like that.
Okay, there you go, Victoria. Look in the guide, which I think you can download on the, like I say, through this webinar platform. Matthew, let me just come back to you on the point the Minister was making about the degree of flexibility in the system, because I think it's obviously something that employers are going to look for. Are you satisfied that as things stand, the reviews, the flexibility is what it needs to be?
Well, I think that's, Kerry, I think on two fronts. I mean, message heard and completely understood. I think business gets it. This is change, and what we're not looking to do is sort of provide feedback that essentially sort of says, can we get back to how we were, and so on. I think that's sort of understood and that's off the table. I think the two bits are, firstly, encouraging about the dynamism of the shortage occupation list, and particularly if that is endeavouring to do a proactive forward look at the skills that we need, as well as your point about a look in the rearview mirror. So that is terrific to hear. And then I think the other piece that we do work very collaboratively on, and we can help to feed in experiences in terms of how the system gets improved and honed in the future, is, for example, are there any sort of unintended bottlenecks or sort of where things are getting stuck that companies are finding difficult to navigate, either in terms of guidance to work with the new rules? Is it about the streamlining of the processes? So that your point about whether it be language tests or wherever else it in the system in terms of the processing, the more we've got opportunity to hone and iron out any wrinkles in those, move it as digital and online as possible. I think those are the improvements and the enhancements that we'll continue to work on in the coming months.
And Kerry, can I add to this actually, because this is really, I think it's really important, Matthew, what you said. The other thing that is really important is all the significant changes that are so beneficial, things like removal of resident labour market test, things like, no targets, this no numbers game point, things like, changes to cooling off. They are such significant changes and so welcomed by the business. It would be really important to make sure that they don't creep back in whatever way, shape or form they take, because at the moment everybody's really counting on those remaining permanent.
Minister, are those things going to remain permanent?
I think we always said, I'll just perhaps briefly cover off the cap on numbers point. We've always said that we do retain an ability if, for example, we identify unusual patterns that, for example, I used archaeologists going on the shortage occupation list. If suddenly a very, very large number of applications came in, we might decide to cap that off, because it would perhaps indicate that something's odd's going on that we need to investigate more, or if there was a very large surge of applications. But generally, our view is that things like removal of the resident labour market test are going to be permanent parts of our system. Some of the cooling off periods, because one of the feedbacks we had from business was how clunky some of that was in terms particularly of intercompany transfers. So rather than having sort of this long, then a cooling off period, we've allowed it that it's accumulative out of a period of time, which allows businesses that a lot more flexibility, particularly those that operate in many ways irrespective of borders. So some of those are things that we do intend to become permanent, and stuff like another change we made was around things like making it easier for workers who've been here for a number of years to settle in the United Kingdom. That may not seem the top thing, because it doesn't mean who you can recruit, but it certainly means we think for those coming into the UK and who've been here a while, it gives them more of a plan for permanence, and of course for their employers as well, knowing that they will be able to, provided they keep meeting the requirements of skilled worker visa, they will be able to get permanent settlement here in the UK along with their immediate family.
Okay, thank you. Minister, since you've touched on this, we had a question in from Brittany Ferries about how intercompany movement of staff will work. Can you just give a brief outline of that?
Yeah, I'd say obviously it has to be said that those like ferry operators and train operators who cross the border, there are some fairly unique immigration rules that apply to them that probably it's not worth me getting into the full details of. But as part of the skilled worker visa, there are what's called an intercompany transfer route. This allows those who qualify under skilled worker to be moved about. It's a building on the current system, but with some differences that allow, as I say, the key one is if you bring someone to UK for a period, there isn't a specific cooling off period afterwards, which was quite clunky under the current system and could actually deter a short deployment that was needed. Whereas under the new system, it's basically you have to count up the number of years out of a number of years, and that's all in the guidance, and we hope will make it a lot simpler for those managing employees who do need to work across boundaries. And there are some provisions in our visitor rules for short-term business minutes for management purposes, although I would say that is more limited in terms of what you can do.
Okay, and a second question again for you, Minister, from Mike Ashmead. This might have seemed a slightly less significant question, I suppose, before lockdown and before working from home, but Mike Ashmead has asked what rules, if any, are there for companies which employ staff working remotely but paid from the UK, working in other countries but paid from the UK?
Yeah, it depends probably where their base of employment is and exactly what work they're doing. But it's probably not new that people employ contractors and others based overseas. Of course, they don't need entry clearance because they're not actually coming into the United Kingdom. So that's, I think, again, depend on the exact details of the role. And I wouldn't get into nuanced pieces of legal advice. But generally, if firms are employing staff remotely, they wouldn't inherently need to apply for entry clearance to come into the United Kingdom.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. I want to spend a bit of time just looking at the question of the sponsorship of jobs and the decision that in order to, you have to have a job in order to apply for a visa to come here, which is not a decision that other countries, for example, Australia, have taken. They allow independent skilled migrants to travel first and look for a job when they get there. And I think the last figures I saw, it seemed that the bulk of skilled jobs in migrant jobs in Australia came through that route rather than through sponsored positions. Why have we decided that that's not appropriate for us?
Yeah, well, we looked at some of the past self-employment routes, which sadly did become open to migration abuse. We are looking at where we could create an unsponsored route for those in the highest skill levels and particular elements of global talent, but in an increasingly digital job market. The idea that people need to walk around businesses in the UK handing out CVs to apply for jobs or go and buy the local paper at a newsagent, that's completely gone. The way of looking for jobs back in the 1950s, 60s and 70s has almost completely disappeared and is online. So we do believe that people can effectively look for work here in the United Kingdom, and as I say, we did have issues with previous self-employment routes. Although again, there are provisions around people looking to come and set up a business here, looking to want to invest. There are a number of routes that sit around our core economic migration routes, and actually there are, and as I touched on earlier, there are routes that do allow people general working rights in the UK that don't require an employer sponsor, such as our family route and the British Nationals Overseas Settlement route that we're creating, that'll launch in January.
Yeah, Matthew, is the CBI content with the situation as it is, or would you have preferred the right for independent skilled migrants to travel?
I think there is, as the Minister just mentioned, a sort of a commitment to look at what might be possible at that route in the future, which is good to hear. But I think the situation that is described for the majority of companies, the fact that there is the sort of requirement for that job to be in place there, I think people understand that.
Okay. Jürgen, I'm just going to come to you with a question from Kirsty Dalgleish, who's asking just a very practical point. During recruitment in the future, when do you recommend asking for proof of right to work, questions on right to work, those very practical things that could turn into hurdles?
I think the most important question is not when, but that you ask of everyone exactly the same question, so you don't fall down in the pit of discrimination sort of issues. Other than that, it really is all around the policy and your global policy as when you are employing migrants.
Okay. And Minister, we had a question about frontier workers. Will it be compliant from January the 1st to continue to work as a frontier worker if one, sorry, this is quite detailed, if one had applied already for the permit but doesn't have a response on this application yet? That may be a...
Okay. No, it's a perfectly reasonable question. If you've applied to for a permit, or you've applied to the European Settlement Scheme, and of course remember there is a grace period in the early part of next year where EEA nationals can still use their national identity card and passport for compliant environment checks. And there is, by the way, if an employer accepts one of those documents and it turns out that person hadn't been in the UK before the end of free movement, the employer is protected that it's a reasonable excuse that they accepted a passport or an EEA identity card as proof of entitlement. If they've applied and they're in our system, then the same as other parts of the migration system, then until the application's resolved, they can continue doing what's their existing leave, if I can put that way, permitted. But the vast majority of frontier workers in the UK are Irish nationals who live in the Republic of Ireland and drive into Northern Ireland, and they do not need to apply for new migration permission given the historic rights of Irish nationals in the UK and of UK nationals in Ireland, codified in the Belfast Agreement.
Okay, we're coming to the end. Minister, we've talked about this as version 1 of a system that will be dynamic, that will change, that will potentially change quite rapidly in the light of circumstances. Have you got a sense yet of which areas of immigration you're likely to look at, or this system you're likely to look at first when you're thinking of changes down the track?
Yeah, I think going down the track, we are looking at more opportunities for digitisation, more opportunities for those looking for entry clearance or to renew their visa to be able to apply from home, building on the smartphone tech we use for the European Settlement Scheme. 4.2 million applications there. I think about 95% of them were done by people using a smart device at home rather than going off to a place to apply. So those are probably some of the more operational things we'll be looking at. We'll certainly be looking at the sponsorship system. One of our goals for 2022 is to look at some reforms we could make there to simplify, again, trying to make it a more user-friendly experience and easier to understand what you need to do to comply, and then to comply with those requirements. And the final point is, again, looking at some of our more, we will go through a process of simplifying some of our more niche routes. But as I said, for now, our real focus is getting this bedded in, giving employers certainty, and making sure that as we come towards the end of the grace period next year, EEA nationals who are entitled to be here under free movement rights have applied for the status they'll need under UK immigration law going beyond the 1st of July.
Okay. Minister, let me thank you very much for joining us. Let me thank Jürgen McCluskey as well, and Matthew Fell. I think it's, as we wrap up, I think it's just to go back to a point that Matthew raised earlier on, I think it's clear that this system is going to change. It's going to evolve quite significantly over time. So the views of people on this call, to be fed in either directly or through the CBI, I think you won't be shouting to avoid by the sound of it. There would be, I think, positive outcomes from that. So do keep that conversation going. But for now, let me say thank you to everybody on the panel, and thank you to everybody else who's joined us. And we look forward to seeing you again next Monday for a webinar about preparing for the end of transition.